Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. In today's episode, I'll be reviewing and commenting on the Joker sequel, Joker, Folly, Adieu, the sequel to the massively successful $1.1 billion grossing Joker film from 2019, which earned Joaquin Phoenix his Academy Award for Best Actor. All of those facts are absolutely bananas, by the way, in my mind. Shortly, you will also expect to see in the feed an episode where I discuss with my sister many of the new content, horror-related releases in October, some new releases, very recently released, the Salem's Lot adaptation, the new Netflix It's What's Inside film premiering this weekend, along with many other films we've watched this year, and basically going through my letterboxed list of horror films I've seen this year and thrillers, and we're going to run through them from my highest to least rated. We often disagree, by the way. My sister and I often have very different opinions, and that is a very entertaining conversation. Expect it in the near future. And next week, many new releases. Sona and I will be discussing the new Apple TV Plus thriller from Alfonso Cuarón, Disclaimer, starring Cate Blanchett. And we'll probably be going week to week, recapping that show. And I'll also be sampling some new thriller series that we're expecting to see this month. Teacup, just to name one, a new horror thriller coming to Peacock, which just got a rave review from, of all people, Stephen King. And if you know Stephen King, when he gives something a really positive review, it's almost certainly terrible. So we'll wait to see how that all pans out. By the way, if you'd like to see a preview of that horror movie list or any of my lists, do check out the show notes for my Letterboxd profile link, and feel free to follow me there. As always, email us at needssomeintroduction@gmail.com. And if you'd like to be part of the show and comment on anything you hear here or recommend something of your own, feel free to record a small audio recording on your app and attach it to your email to me, and maybe we'll have a listener feedback episode sometime in the future. Okay, so Joker, Folly, Adieu. Going into seeing this film, I was very wary, but very curious, because I have a very strange relationship with Todd Phillips films in general, and I'm always kind of astounded by the success of his films. I don't really appreciate him as a filmmaker, but he definitely has a point of view, or believes it does. He takes his craft seriously. And I find it absolutely stunning that Joker, the film Joker, was such a phenomenal success. For me, the Joker film probably could have passed as like a 3-star film. It's a film I really did not like, but I probably could have given it a barely passing grade 2.5 or 3 stars if it hadn't been for them shoehorning in the Batman material, trying to tie it into a broader mythology around Batman. But I understand the necessity for that in getting a film produced. But beyond that, the film itself, I felt, was pretty unsuccessful. And I guess your mileage may vary. There are some people who are really huge advocates for that film. And I do think that if you don't see it as purely this pastiche of Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy. The King of Comedy, by the way, I think most people have seen Taxi Driver, but you should rewatch it if you are a fan of Joker and see a much better version of this kind of antisocial figure. But much less seen is The King of Comedy, which is also an absolutely brilliant film and isn't as well known as many of other Scorsese's films. But if Joker had come out and flopped at the box office, I would have been just like, well, it was an interesting experiment. And if Joker had come out and been modestly successful, I don't think it would have had the kind of critical backlash that the film eventually received. But it's almost like you have to look at that film purely as some strange cultural artifact. What drives people to watch this film, which I honestly felt was so unpleasant? There's really nothing entertaining in that film. And it's fine, by the way. I have watched films that I do not find entertaining. I understand the appeal of that. But I don't anticipate them to be blockbusters. So I had to assume that people were basically experiencing that film in a very different way than I was. For a film to make well over $300 million in the United States and another $800 or so million around the world, people must be having fun at the movie theater. The King of Comedy was a huge disaster when it came out, by the way, for the historical record. But no one's going to watch The King of Comedy and be like, wow, that thing's going to make $100 million. So, and you could say, well, they put a Batman connection to it. This film outgrossed any Batman film. So there was something going on culturally that I guess I kind of missed, that people are people are experiencing this film in a particular way. By the way, there's a caveat there when I say it's outgrossed any Batman movie. I'm talking about worldwide. the Christopher Nolan Batman movies were much more successful in the US. You would adjust for inflation, yada, yada, yada. Okay, I know all that. I'm just saying that on its face, you think about a film that is aggressively antisocial. Let's say Fight Club, for example. Fight Club was a huge flop. It did eventually find a huge audience. But if this thing had performed like Fight Club, I wouldn't have been so surprised. By the way, I'm a huge fan of Fight Club, and I think that the more times you watch it, the more reads you can have on the material. The problem with The Joker, as edgy as it is and as afraid everybody was when that film was about to come out, is that it has no edge, honestly. And if anybody who thought the film was somehow dangerous in some way, all you had to see was the addition of the Batman character that would have immediately removed any countercultural edge that the film has when you're trying to make a Batman movie. So I never saw it as a dangerous film in any possible way. But people were afraid of that, right? Like when they had the premiere in New York, they were afraid there might be some copycat Joker attacks or something. And of course, there had been a terrorist attack during the midnight screenings for The Dark Knight Rises. So Warner Brothers was obviously concerned. But when you actually see the film, it seems so misdirected because the film is obviously a pastiche of these previous things that I mentioned before, the Scorsese films. It's convincingly made. It has nice aesthetics, which I think Todd Phillips in general does have good aesthetics with his films. But the film just being about this antisocial character who eventually achieves this transcendence by becoming violent, by becoming this other character. If he had a philosophy, if he had a political point of view, and he wasn't just someone who was mentally unstable, it could have been a transgressive film of some kind. But the film as it is, it's just this complete loser who accidentally becomes a cultural figure. In a bizarre way, it almost is a metaphor for the film, I think an unintentional one. But at the same time, it's the only way to read the film in an interesting way is the product that it became an essential film for a subset of filmgoers. And the reason I'm setting so much context here is because I think the only interesting way to read this film, the second one, the Folly, Adieu, is in relationship to the culture's relationship to the first film. And I think that is very, very intentional. I also find it very interesting in the context of Todd Phillips' career that previous to the Joker film, obviously the most culturally significant film he had ever made was The Hangover, which was a surprise mega blockbuster around the world. And then even more so when it came on home video, became one of those films that everybody watched over and over again on HBO and bought the DVDs and watched it with their friends and quoted it and dressed up as these characters on Halloween. And then very intentionally, The Hangover 2 was considered a lazy sequel to the original. And if anything, a negative reaction by the filmmaker, as if he's saying, you guys like these guys, these losers? And as if The Hangover 2 did not drive that point home, it really felt like everybody involved by Hangover 3 hated these characters, hated to be making that movie, and were just punishing the audience for requesting a third go-round. And of course, the box office indicated this as well, as the grosses plunged between the second and third film. And I'm going to spend another minute talking about Phillips in general, because if you look at his entire filmography, here's somebody who began his career with a documentary about fraternity life, which very similar to almost his entire through line in his entire career. He is photographing this rite of passage of these young men who are making asses of themselves, and he is commenting on it like, can you believe these jerks? But he kind of is advocating for it in his representation of it. So he's indulging in it and yet commenting on it. And of course, he also made a documentary about G.G. Allin. Anybody who knows, basically a musician and a personality, like an overt troll to his audience, treating them terribly, and people just showing up to be abused by this performer over and over again until his death, literally threatening to blow himself up on stage, and people showing up to see if he'll do it, theoretically endangering their own lives if this actually was to occur. And when you think about G.G. Allin and these other cultural figures he seems to be interested in, it's not surprising that you see his actual filmography where it is a muted version of that. He's bringing some of that to Road Trip and then Old School. And then, of course, the Hangover movies, which really, by the time you get to the Hangover movies, these films, even the first one, I was so surprised when I read reviews for The Hangover 3, for example, where critics had turned aggressively against the series of films and were surprised to find like, man, this whole film is about death and it's so dark and grim and unfunny, which honestly, I felt like that about the first Hangover film. And I feel like the public opinion didn't come around to that till the third. And that's how I feel, honestly, about everyone's reaction at this moment, this early reaction that I've seen from critics who have seen this new Joker film. The reaction is, this is such a grim slog, and there's no action in this movie. And I'm like, there was action in the first Joker movie. That wasn't a grim slog. That wasn't a depressing film. Like, why are people reacting this way to this movie? So it is very surprising for me to see this reaction, as if the critiques that are being made now of this film are almost universally equally valid to the first. And yet it's as if people are surprised by this all of a sudden. All this is to say that I was very interested in seeing the film because I had not liked the first film. Not because I had liked it, but because I had not. And the whole idea that he's intentionally trying to subvert what people liked about the first film. This is a tight wire act that required someone that I felt probably needed a lot more skill than Phillips had from what I'd seen of his skill level up until that point. But it is an ambitious thing to basically take one of the most popular films of the past few years and then intentionally interrogate the audience that embraced it to antagonize them intentionally. And you could argue he has done this before. He's done it before with his exploration of G.G. Allen, for example. He has done this with the Hangover films, but never to this extent, because the Joker film is so much more successful than those previous films. So I was skeptical but intrigued. And then I go see the film itself. I've just seen it. And if you do plan to see this film, I think it's worth seeing without too much critical analysis ahead of time, because it's an actual experience of going through the film where, for the first half of the film or so, I really liked it. I really liked it. And maybe that's a spoiler for my overall reaction right there, but I really did like this film for about its first half of its running time. It's only a little over 2 hours. And I don't remember the length of the first film, but this one doesn't feel as long as the first film. It's really felt like it was dragging on. And maybe it was also because you had shoehorned in these other plot elements trying to tie it into broader Gotham and, of course, the Batman storyline, or Bruce Wayne, I guess, not Batman yet. And in this film, the basic framework of it, no spoilers here, it's all in the trailer. Honestly, basically the entire frame of the film is in the trailer, but you have Arthur Fleck, the Joker character. He is now incarcerated back in Arkham Asylum, shot at the abandoned Essex County Hospital, by the way, right by my home here in New Jersey. And he's on his medication. He is a celebrity now due to this incredibly notorious event of murdering someone on screen, obviously. A very famous, like a David Letterman-like character on live television. And one day he catches the eye of this character, Lee, played by Lady Gaga. Very well, by the way. Lady Gaga proves again that she has a real on-screen charisma. She's definitely the highlight of this film, not only for her performance, but for her singing, because there's a lot of music in this. And they lock eyes. She knows who he is, and they begin a romance inside of the prison. And many aspects of the romance itself play out as they sing show tunes. They disappear into this shared fantasy space, a folie à deux. For anybody who doesn't know that is the actual terminology, it is a French term for a psychosis that is shared between multiple people. In this case, the folie à deux is between Joker and Harley Quinn. And the musical numbers could be a little more over the top. Like, I mean, if this is a true escape, it should go full on fantasy sequence, I think. The palette doesn't change significantly enough. It still is pretty muted in the same tone as much of the rest of the film. But it is still a bit of an escape for these characters. And those sequences work pretty well. And the whole buildup of the relationship works, I think, pretty well for most of the runtime of the film. And in parallel, of course, the trial is commencing. His defense attorney is played by Catherine Keener. And the prosecutor is Harvey Dent, played by Harry Laudy from Industry. Very underused. I mean, this could have been any character. When I first heard that he had been cast in this role, he's gotten a little bit of heat from that Industry. A few of the characters there in Industry have caught some heat here. I thought this would be, he gets a decent amount of screen time, but honestly, anyone could play this role. I wouldn't be surprised if the intention, of course, is to somehow continue this series in some additional spin-offs, and they wanted Harvey Dent to potentially be Two-Face at some point in the future. I don't think that's going to happen after this film. And as I mentioned, you see all this in the trailer. There's the musical sequences, the brutalization he's dealing with in the prison, psychological and physical. He's a bit of a celebrity among the other inmates. The Joker persona, for the most part, has been subsumed by the medication and by regrets around some of his actions. And all of this is very convincingly laid out. So for more than half of the film's runtime, I am giving it the benefit of the doubt. I'm really curious as to how they're going to pay this off and I am intrigued by this theme, which is the same theme as the first film, but a little more well explored here, of someone who is just crushed under heels so many times and how he becomes this icon to similarly oppressed and depressed people. And there are warnings and hints that Harley Quinn is really just a fan. It's not real. She doesn't love him for who he is, but only for the Joker character, only for the chaos and the promise of this impossible fantasy that Joker represents. And long story short, with maybe the last 30 to 50 minutes of this film, probably closer to 50 because the last 20 minutes or so are pretty dragged out, all of this buildup really leads to nothing. The film just has really nothing to say, and it's a shocking surprise. It is going to be a troll on its audience because it doesn't pay off to the Joker diehards who saw him as some kind of antisocial icon. But just like the first film, which didn't even have the nerve to be truly edgy, and I thought that was constrained by Warner Brothers basically saying, well, you have to make this a true Joker film and tie it into the DC universe, yada, yada. In this film, I really feel like he probably would have carte blanche at this point, considering the success of the first film. He spent $200 million. Wait till you see this movie if you go see it. I do not know how they spent $200 million. I know that everyone got paid very, very well. But even with all the salaries, you probably have a production budget that's way over $120 million or so, which is more than the entire budget of the first film, double the entire budget of the first film. And the scope of the film is not significantly larger than that first film. So I really don't understand where they spent the money. And I really don't care. I'm just bringing up the finances of it in the fact that he truly had an opportunity to make exactly the film he wanted to, no questions asked, probably with no intervention. And still the film has very little to say. In the same way that there is no philosophy behind Joker in the first film, you would think, well, that's the opportunity in the second film to have Arthur Fleck decide to embrace this persona, to become an anarchist, or to somehow channel these feelings, this public that he has, for some kind of terrorism that represents his point of view, or to try to advocate for some cause, and maybe everyone laughs at him afterwards. And that would be the point of the film as well. But he just has no point of view. And the film itself has no point of view. And it once again becomes an unintentional metaphor for the film itself, in the same way that the first film is a film that's really not about anything, is not really edgy at all, but then becomes this cultural touchstone where people are afraid of the film. He's advocating for anarchy, where the media's reaction is hysterical. But then there are fans who maybe saw the film in that light, even though it's not in the text at all. This film becomes an inadvertent metaphor for now having this mantle, this cultural moment, and then with the lights on and this performance, this new context to the original film, now's the time to like boldly turn to the camera and say something, and the film says nothing. Okay, I'm going to go into spoilers in a few minutes, but before then, I want to talk about the actual box office prospects for this particular film. I'm very curious to see, especially with the much bigger spend on the budget and on the advertising budget, I'm sure, which will be significantly increased as well. Warner Brothers definitely wants to get this movie to open over $100 million. The first one opened with around 90, and most people who saw it liked it very much. So I assume they are targeting a $100+ million opening weekend. Tracking was very good, bigger than Beetlejuice, which did open with well over $100 million just recently, the Beetlejuice sequel. But the recent tracking shows that interest has dropped way off. I think a lot of this has to do with the negative word of mouth coming from the film festivals. I mean, this film's not going to make $1 billion. This film's not going to make $500 million. I'm pretty sure it will not make $500 million. Will it make $400 million? That might be enough to break even, but that might be as high as this film can go. I could be wrong. Maybe audiences will embrace this one in the way that they embraced the first film, which once again, walking out of the first film, I did not think the film was going to be anywhere near as big as it turned out to be. So maybe there is some hope for this from a financial perspective. I don't think this is a film that people are going to revisit in the future. Okay, before I get to the spoilers, a few Joaquin Phoenix recommendations I have for you. I don't love the Joker performance that he gives, even in the first film. There are moments of it that are truly transcendent. Really, when he's becoming, there are multiple scenes where you see him becoming the Joker, and the performance really works for me. But most of the time, I really didn't enjoy the performance. But I am a huge fan of Joaquin Phoenix. I think he is one of the absolute best actors of his generation. And here's a few recommendations I have for you that I would recommend over this film, to say the least. First of all, if you want to see somebody who has mommy and daddy issues, who is a true anti-social character that goes on a vendetta killing spree, check out You Were Never Really There, which is available on Amazon Prime. This is from Lynn Ramsey, made in 2017, just 2 years before The Joker, by the way. Instead of being absolutely emaciated like he is in the Joker films, he's actually beefed up significantly. And of course, this film definitely has a lineage all the way back to the misguided, psychologically damaged potential war veteran who's trying to save a young girl from sexual enslavement, just like Taxi Driver. So there's another Taxi Driver connection, but this is a much more intriguing film and exceptionally well made, very moody. Lynn Ramsey's direction, some of her best direction. Speaking of protagonists that have significant mommy issues, there's an excellent film called Two Lovers from back in 2008, directed by James Gray. And it deals with this character who is too old to be still as dependent on his mother and is basically in some form of arrested development, and this unhealthy relationship he gets into with another blonde. This one is Gwyneth Paltrow in this case. I'm not a huge fan of her in general either, but she gives a terrific performance here in this film as well. So some of the same themes we have here in this particular Joker film. And lastly, Her from Spike Jonze, just from 11 years ago now, past its 10th anniversary. And here's somebody who gets and falls in love with another inadvertent femme fatale. In this case, it is the voice of Scarlett Johansson as a AI personal assistant. Anyone who's afraid of getting into a parasocial relationship with their AI, well, here's a film about it 10 years before we all started talking about it, thanks to ChatGPT. And this one's available on HBO Max, so if you have Max and you're going to check out Joker, don't do that. Check out Her instead. All right, so here's the plot breakdown and spoilers and some additional critical notes on the new Joker film. The film begins with a Looney Tunes-like sequence that shows the Joker on the set of the show in which he killed the Robert De Niro character. I believe it's supposed to be the same set. It's very much done in this style of the Looney Tunes character. And we see that the Joker makeup and clothing, the actual suit, have locked up Arthur Fleck in his wardrobe inside of the dressing room and goes out on stage as its own character. And I think he kills some people backstage, or at least beats them up pretty badly. This is the costume. Meanwhile, Arthur Fleck's character is trying to break out. He's in his underwear. He steps out on stage right after the Joker character. The audience is hooting, hollering. And eventually the makeup and the character merge together in the costume so that it's now this combination makeup and Arthur Fleck. This is the Joker, I guess. The two things combined. And the cops show up and beat him badly. Still in the cartoon, that is. And this is an introduction to the reality of Fleck now in prison. Phoenix is perhaps even more gaunt than he was in the first film. And the prison guards keep asking him over and over again, hey, got a joke for me today? Got a joke for me today? Apparently, he used to tell jokes all the time. Most prominent amongst the abusive guards is Brendan Gleeson. He's going to court. This has been a few years now, just like the movie. It's been a few years since from the killing. But we find out that there are still people who turn up dressed up as Joker at the court proceedings. Catherine Keener, as her lawyer, seems to be actually concerned for his well-being and is trying to convince him that the Joker character is another personality that he had inside of him, and that his abuse, his neglect, his bullying from all these other people in his life caused this secondary persona to emerge and was the killer. Basically, he was insane, and that's going to be their defense for all 5 killings. Actually, he keeps pointing out multiple times that is actually 6 killings because he also killed his mother, even though people don't know that. But he keeps telling everybody, so I guess they do. And this is really the big thematic arc of the entire film, is this denial that the Joker character is Arthur Fleck, that these two persona are the same, and how he is suppressing this with medication and with his behavior, even though, of course, the other inmates in the prison want to see this persona emerge again. And one inmate in particular, of course, Harley Quinn. There's a lot of commentary on there was a movie, a not very good movie at one point, described as a TV movie about the crimes he committed. So in a way, that is the surrogate within the film for the first Joker film, as if the first Joker film was the film that everybody saw, and this is the reality of what's actually happening. That's one possible way we're supposed to interpret all of this. there definitely is minimally a inside joke, the Todd Phillips joke on himself saying like, that first movie, not so good, huh? Well, I don't know if he actually believes that. I just think that that's part of the joke here. And there's a lot of shuffling around, and you see this routine he has. He's bullied by the guards. Some of the most mentally unstable people in the prison are most attracted to him. And during one of these back and forth morning routines, he hears a choir of singers in one of the rooms he's passing, one of the activity rooms. And of course, you've seen this in the trailer. If you've seen the trailer, he sees Harley Quinn for the first time. She's a fan. She imitates the shooting of the De Niro character from the first film, whose name I can't remember. She tells him that her mother committed her. She has a poor girl story. Like him, I grew up in the same neighborhood as you. None of this turns out to be true eventually, but it is a way for her to bond with him. She's like, I wish I had killed my parents. And despite the context of the conversation, it is kind of cute the way they are connecting with each other. And then he decides he wants to participate in the singing group. Brendan Gleeson thinks it'll be a good thing for him. The Brendan Gleeson character is one of the most interesting characters in the film, maybe unintentionally so. But the fact that he starts off as just this brute who wants to undermine Arthur Fleck, but then he turns out that he likes musical theater too. They sing together at points. He seems to want to get him into this group, but then when he sees Fleck be happy at one point, he shoves him down the hallway, actually pretty early on. So it is interesting. It's interesting that he has these almost an internal struggle of his own. The film doesn't explore this in any way, but it is interesting that they at least add it here. At one point, they're all watching a musical together, and Harley wants him to try to escape. And he's like, I'm watching the movie. This is the good part. They're about to sing. He's like very much into this musical that he used to watch with his mom, old-timey musicals. He seems to love them. So she decides to set a fire there. And in the ensuing ruckus, they try to make an escape. Apparently, there's all this media outside waiting to catch a glimpse of him because he's about to go. The trial's about to begin. So it's very much present in the news. We hear multiple headlines about it multiple times throughout the film. They both get in trouble for this. He ends up in solitary confinement. He wakes up one night and she's in solitary confinement with him. I honestly didn't know if this was actually happening or not. Was this all in his head? But then they have sex at the end of this scene, and later she's pregnant. So I assume this happened. He seems to be really surprised when she says that she's pregnant, as if he didn't really believe that scene happened either. So I don't know, but not exactly clear in the context of the film, but it's hard to tell exactly when something's real and something's not because it all has similar visual palette. So maybe that's a reason they should have had a more heightened fantasy signifiers, but they do have sex, I think, the only time in the entire film. By the way, didn't even think about this when I was watching the film. Don't know why. But how the heck is she even in the prison with him? Okay, it's a psych hospital, but it's a co-ed psych hospital. And now I got to remember, even when she's in the singing room, is she the only woman in there? How the hell did she get into this prison? And even if they have a psych ward and then they have the prisoners ward, which maybe happens. I mean, it's Arkham Asylum, so God knows how that works because in the cartoons and in the comic books, yeah, they have co-ed, I guess, there when they're all supervillains. But anyway, doesn't seem to be the case in the reality of this film. And then how would she get into his actual solitary confinement? She would have to somehow have gotten from one prison wing to the other. I suddenly have many, many questions about how she ever got anywhere near him, which then makes me think the whole thing is in his head, although that can't be the case because we have scenes that are only from her perspective. So no, it just doesn't make any sense. That's it. She also informs him at this point that she's leaving the prison, but that's a good thing because she'll be able to see him in court. The next day, he has an interview scheduled, and the interviewer shows up. This is Steve Coogan, and Catherine Keener is there as well, supervising the interview. She doesn't like the direction it's going. He's antagonistic right away, and Arthur's been coached to try to play that I was insane, I don't remember anything, and he starts getting really angry. Why are you talking about the Joker? Why don't you ask me about the way I am now? And this time he starts to sing on camera. And as is often the case with musicals, the things that the characters are trying to say to each other or say out loud are encapsulated in the music itself. But it is interesting that the first time he breaks into song, there's a fantasy sequence where he's singing and the inmate starts singing along with him. And we find out that that didn't happen, that he snaps back to the reality. And in this case, he actually is singing. So we're drifting more in the direction of the fantastical. Harley sees this out in the street. She smashes a window to take the TV with her, which is all ridiculous. By the way, this is like, if you don't remember from the first film, this is like 1980s New York. So this is not a flat screen TV. This is an old tube TV, like a small one they would put on top of a piece of furniture. So she smashes the window, takes the TV with her, which of course, as soon as it's unplugged, it's unplugged. He gets to court. He's trying to see if Harley is sitting nearby. The court's proceedings begin. It's a madhouse outside, journalists and fans out there. Early on, we have this pretty fun sequence. If you're a fan of industry, it's fun because Harry Laude gets to question Ken Leung on the stand, both from the industry series. And honestly, we get a microcosm in the courtroom. This is when the film starts to lose its way for me. We're almost halfway through at this point. We're around halfway through, I think. And this whole sequence here really starts to lose me for the fact that we're really just retreading the first film again, where now in one room, basically, we have different people coming up. They are breaking his reality by mentioning the abuse he suffered, the sexual abuse from his mother, what his mother actually thought of him, how she made fun of him for not actually having any comedic abilities, and how she had said that to him, that, because he had this nervous laugh that she's like, well, that's just because you're going to be a comedian. You're going to make the whole world laugh one day. And she couldn't believe how absolutely not funny he was and that he took this seriously. And if this is devastating to his ego. So it's just like one blow after another to his self-perception and a destruction of his fantasy world, basically, which once again went pretty thoroughly explored in the first film. And it's from both sides. The people who are benevolently trying to protect him, saying that, well, he had this alternate personality, also says, well, it was brought upon him by this abuse that he suffered. So basically, the reality of the world among people who are supposed to be helping him and the people who are trying to put him in prison, in both cases, are just shattering any kind of fantasy world he has. They read his journals out loud as if that's not bad enough. One more insult. And you start to see that outside the courtroom, Harley is getting famous herself because she is aggressively attacking the defense and the prosecutor. So she's on screen a lot. So there is a question, which is once again relatively unexplored here, that whether she has real feelings for him or not, that her primary reason for being there is to piggyback onto his fame, which I think is what the filmmaker is trying to interrogate here, is how these sycophantic people start to treat these criminals like they are celebrities and victims. And I guess I'll bring it up right now. There is a film that's coming out for rent this very week that's been playing for about a year in different markets called Red Rooms, which I highly recommend. And it's a film about these hangers-on, these women who are obsessed with the trial of a serial killer. This is in Canada. This film is brilliant, one of the best films I've seen this year, and it interrogates that very idea. This film, the Joker film, can't even touch this particular theme in a way that film does, which, I mean, it's the entire theme of that film, so obviously it's not the primary concern of this Joker film, but it's just to speak to the fact that this type of idea that Todd Phillips seems to want to explore is an interesting enough concept for an entire film, but he just has these things that he throws in. Going back to the original Joker film, there are these ideas that it's the abuse that made him this way. It was his mental illness. It's the shame about mental illness. It's his own fixation with being famous. There's all these reasons that he may be the way he is, but the film doesn't ever have an opinion on it or doesn't ever try to subvert that in some way and that's what made him into a inadvertent cultural icon. Like it doesn't say anything interesting about its own themes. It just basically presents things, or really just signifiers for those themes rather than ever exploring them deeply in any way. And this is just another example of that. And then for me, this is maybe right around the middle of the film is when we get maybe its best scene for me, after he finds out the truth about how Harley had self-committed and was some fan of the Joker anyway, maybe not of him actually. And the whole truth of her backstory comes out. He has this fantasy sequence where he is once again on this late night TV type show where they are on stage together and they're singing this Bee Gees song together, To Love Somebody, which culminates with her shooting him in the gut. And of course, now he's back in the grim reality of being in the prison again. He's less docile at this point. He's stopped taking his medication. He's not as compliant as he was at the beginning of the film. Phoenix does a good job here of just showing in his face how he has re-embraced that darker side of himself. He confronts Harley Quinn, and she admits that, yes, all the things that he said about her are true. She is rich. She's just a fan. She wanted to meet him. And hey, it worked, right? So it doesn't mean her feelings aren't real. And I think this is when she finally tells him that she's pregnant. I think this is the scene where it happens. Back in the courtroom, there's, I almost forgot to mention this, there's Zazie Beetz is back from the original film. I was pretty certain when I saw the first film that she had died. We saw him in the room with her and her daughter, and then he's on his murder spree. So I just assumed she was part of that murder spree, but nope, she's alive. He didn't injure her, and she's there to testify to what happened. She feels guilty that she didn't say anything before. She didn't say anything because she was afraid of him. She lived in the building with them. He had never been violent with her, so he just assumed that things were going to be status quo. She had spoken to the mom. She had some sympathy because he was a pretty pathetic character. Some of those revelations that I mentioned before about things that the mother said about him. All of this is pushing him towards becoming the Joker character again. And then he has another musical sequence where he is, again, now fully in the Joker regalia in the courtroom. And he just snaps at that moment, fires his attorney and says, I'm going to be my own attorney from now on. Harley Quinn is ecstatic about this. She gets to kiss him. I'm pretty sure that would never happen. Even if it is just the lock up, the jail, I guess they call it, right? The jail inside the courtroom. Even if it's just there, they would not allow her to be that close to him. She could have passed him a weapon. And once again, his Joker persona is now starting to emerge back at the prison. It's starting to get people riled up. They don't like this. There's this theme, by the way, the Saints come marching in, right? Is that's like kind of a rallying call that people multiple times keep singing. The Saints come marching in. It's a theme throughout the entire film. It's almost like his theme song in some ways. The next time he's in the courtroom, he's in the Joker makeup. Is not going to win you over, sway you over to the jury, by the way. If you're trying to convince people that you're not the Joker character and you show up in Joker makeup, probably not the best defense. I don't think he's really concerned about that at this point. They do passingly mention that, hey, I couldn't find anything in the bylaws that says he can't wear makeup to court. So I guess he gets to wear it. They bring up Gary Puddles, who is this small person from the first Joker film. He murdered someone right in front of him. I actually thought he had died as well, but I guess he did not. And basically testifies that someone is murdered right in front of his face. I actually thought they could have done something interesting with this cross-examination, but if anything, it seems to be more just laying on that the Joker is like a bad guy. But I think it would have been more interesting to be like, didn't he bully you as well, Gary? And yeah, they could have been something subversive here where they could have used this as a transitional point where he was wrong in the facts, right? This guy's confessing that, yeah, I saw him murder somebody, but don't we all want to murder jerks sometimes? It's not that I'm not saying that I'm not a proponent of that philosophy. I'm just saying that he could have done something here transgressive, and he doesn't. He just basically takes it when he goes, you're the one who scared me. I'm afraid of you. I have nightmares about you. And it's just laying on more of the same. Joker's bad, which, I mean, we all know that, I hope. Or maybe that's what Phillips is trying to say. Hey, for all of you people out there who think Joker's good, guess what? Joker's bad. And then the prosecution rests, and Arthur Fleck, surprise, surprise, he says the defense rests as well. He's got no defense to offer. Once again, not the best option when you take over as your own defense. We have another musical sequence here where I don't know this song, Build a Mountain. I don't know if this is an original song or if this is an old song. Maybe I just don't know it. Maybe it's from a musical. Maybe it has something thematically important in it because they bring it up many times. It's the Harley Quinn Joker combo theme concept of them building a mountain together. What that really means, I'm not sure if the film even knows. And then that night, things go really badly at the prison. They wash off his makeup. They strip off his clothes. They kill a neighboring prisoner who's been his most adamant puppy dog throughout this whole entire time. And then it's the day of the sentencing. Lee shows up. Harley Quinn shows up at the proceedings, puts on full Joker makeup. When it's time for him to make his closing statement, the judge warns him. He has pulled out a chair, by the way, pulls out a chair, puts it down, and sits on it like as if he's about to do his stand-up. The judge warns him, this is not a stage. You are not in a comedy club. You are not on stage. And then Arthur looks directly at the camera who's filming these proceedings, and we see him through the camera. And we see the television watching him through the camera. And I guess if this film works for you, this is the scene that will make or break for you. But this idea that, oh, he is on stage. We are watching these criminals like it's just entertainment. And I guess that is the one theme that is playing out here, at least in this section of the film, but it still doesn't have a minor indictment of that. But I don't know. It's just not enough interesting in that theme, to be honest with you. And this is where the film could become about something. I was still kind of hoping that maybe we get some surprising break with reality or some twist or some escape or something, something. everybody's waiting to see what he's going to say. And he says, I was going to come up here and rail against all of you being hypocrites and for not supporting basically the poor and the disenfranchised and the people who end up like me, who no one pays attention to until something terrible happens. That could have been an interesting moment in the film. But he goes, I'm not going to do any of that. I'm going to tell you that I am not Joker. I'm just Arthur Fleck. I killed those people. I remember doing it. I'm guilty. That's it. And he explicitly says it was all just a fantasy. The whole idea that this was going to work out and the whole persona and my expectation that I would become famous and go on TV, all of it was just a fantasy. And he says he wants to kill Joker, basically, and start a new life and accept the mistakes he's made. Harley doesn't want to hear that. She storms off. He awaits the verdict, which they come back after just an hour or so, not surprisingly. He calls her on a payphone and sings to her, If You Go Away. He comes back into the courtroom, most of the makeup washed off. And then just as they read the verdict, they find him guilty. He starts to laugh maniacally, his nervous laughter. And then once again, we see this in the trailer. We're just a few minutes from the end of the film. We see a giant explosion. There's a car bomb has gone off outside the courtroom. And it seems that many people survived this because you start to see them moving around. But Arthur's like really near the epicenter of the explosion. But I guess because of the position of the wall or whatever, it just knocks him down. And this whole sequence is very well done, by the way. The silence, the dirt, this is very 9/11 coded. And he wanders out into the city, which is covered in this debris from the explosion. And some other people dressed up as Joker see him. They recognize him right away, throw him into the car and try to escape with him. The sound is muffled here, so he's only getting parts of the news broadcast of what's happened, but also you overhear the conversation in the car where these people seem to be very excited by the fact that they have him. They have the Joker. And there's a version of reality, I guess, where he runs off with them, but instead he escapes from the cab, goes running down the street. They pursue him for a little bit, and he's working his way back to his apartment. The stairs, the large staircase, the most famous probably moment from the original Joker film. He had found out that Harley whose family was rich, had actually bought his old apartment. So apparently, I guess she's been staying there. We see her put a gun to her head earlier when Arthur had refuted his Joker character, but apparently she has not killed herself. He sees her on the stairs and runs up. This is a lot of stairs, and he's winded for the rest of the film, which is understandable. And then he's happy that he runs into her and says, I'm ready to run off with you. Look, I escaped. I want us to be together. But she says, no, you told me you weren't the Joker anymore. And all we had was the fantasy. I'm not sure what this means, to be honest with you. I mean, I understand what it means. I don't know what the dialogue that's written here, but she pulls it off for the most part. And then she sings That's Entertainment. So once again, the idea that she was only there for the show, she was there only for the drama, and that when he strips that all back and says, no, I just want to be with you, I don't have to be Joker. You can be with me, with Arthur. And she's like, I don't want Arthur. I want the Joker. Once again, this is an interesting theme. You think about stories of cult leaders, for example, that come up with some cockamamie scheme and use their charisma to get people to invest in some crazy idea. And then it's like a suicide cult or something. And he goes, well, we don't actually have to commit the suicide part. And these diehards are like, what do you mean? That's why we're here. And it's as if the cult takes over the original idea. They take ownership of it. And we see this even in popular culture now, not with murders, of course, or suicides, although that happens also, but more so with just people taking control of a narrative where they just think they have ownership of something that they don't necessarily didn't create or really have no control over. But now they decide that, no, I tell you when this is over. Once again, an interesting theme, and it could have been something that was drawn out over the course of the film, but it's really just thrown in here almost as if they needed to add themes to this story, which is so bare bones. Like there's not much that happens. And as she departs, the cops are there. Of course, they've also seen that TV movie, which probably had a famous sequence shot on the same stairs. So they know where he's going. He's back in prison. They tell him, you have a guest. I was very curious to know who is coming to see him. Is it his lawyer? Is it Harley again? Did she actually come? We never find out, because on his way to meeting with his guest, this creepy guy, I was wondering, like, where does this guy tie into this story? We have this character that is very pronouncedly just creepily hanging out in the background multiple times. And I thought, is this going to be some kind of inside of the prison cult that is going to bust him out or take over the prison? I thought there would be maybe more action here at the end of the film. But no, he's just here because he turns up and sneaks up behind him and says, hey, I got a joke to tell you. it's some joke about a clown and getting what you deserve. That's the punchline to the joke, which of course is him stabbing him multiple times in the gut. And this flashes back in his mind's eye to Harley shooting him at that midpoint of the film. And he collapses to the floor and dies. And that's the end of the movie. And honestly, that is it. Like, there's not much to the film. He's in prison. There's the court proceedings going on. He meets Lee. They have multiple musical fantasy sequences. At trial, during all the testimony, he decides to take control of his own defense. His defense ends up being like, I'm just going to dress like the Joker and be like, hey, no defense. And then in the 11th hour, when he's about to lay it all on and make some big performance on TV and rally his troops to potentially stir up a riot in the middle of the streets, he instead turns to the camera and goes, it's all my fault. I did it all. And even then, when he's potentially doing the right thing by being culpable for his own bad acts, it still has a terrorist attack in the streets, and people are still trying to drag him into the Joker persona, including Harley, who's disappointed with him having turned his back on it. And he wants to be with her and says, hey, we could be together. I'll be Arthur and you can be Lee. And she's like, nope, I want the Joker. And then he goes back into prison. And while he's awaiting his sentencing, he is murdered. End of movie. So yeah, it is interesting that this is the choice for one of the most anticipated films of the year, which theoretically could have outgrossed the previous film, could have been one of the very highest grossing films of all times, and is not going to be that. And it doesn't have to be that, by the way. But I feel it's kind of a missed opportunity for having truly, potentially transgressive. And what it turns out being is the only transgression of this whole entire film ends up being that the fans of the first film are going to be really disappointed in this one, which I guess in its own way is a trollish thing to do, but it's not an extremely antisocial thing to do, to basically take the money and run and scold the audience that made the first film into a huge hit for liking it. I'm not sure if that is, it's definitely not a good strategy from a box office perspective, but not really an interesting route to take. And I don't think this is going to be the cultural conversation piece that the first one was, which of course is going to impact its grosses as well. Anyway, I've probably spent too much time breaking down this film anyway. I doubt I will ever think about it again much, unless it does surprise me and take off culturally. I think within a couple of weeks, no one's going to talk about this film anymore. That's unfortunate to some extent. You do have Lady Gaga. I think she will escape unscathed for the most part because she is really charismatic. She creates a three-dimensional character. You understand Harley Quinn. She's not a necessarily great character. She's someone who is sycophantic and only interested in this fantasy, explicitly says so. So she's definitely not a role model of any kind, but she's an interesting character. And she sounds great. She sings beautifully in most of her musical performances. And Joaquin Phoenix, I didn't love his performance in the first film. I think he's fine here. I definitely prefer him in Joker mode, by the way, in general here. I think that is always interesting to see him in that mode in both films. And you know what? He sings some of the songs pretty well. I mean, sometimes when he's duetting, he can't possibly hold a candle to Lady Gaga, of course. But he's got a couple of solos where the emotion of the moment pulls off the vocals. So he does fine as that as well, as you would expect. He's not an amateur. He's one of our best actors. But overall, it's not even interesting enough in its failure to be worth I can't believe they did that type reaction. It's just kind of there. It's really feels like almost the least they could have done to make a sequel to this original film. All right, so not exciting. Unfortunately, not good news for people who are looking forward to that. And not even good news if you just want some cool, interesting cultural conversation. I would have taken either. We get neither. Back to our schedule, of course. Expect to see episodes in the near future discussing some of the spooky season content that is out there right now, a rundown of many movies, hopefully something you can add to your queues for the rest of October. And next week also, Sona and I will begin to discuss the new Alfonso Cuarón thriller, Disclaimer, which also played at the Venice Film Festival and got some pretty strong reviews. So I'm very much looking forward to that. This is his first TV series and first work of any kind since Roma, some 5 or 6 years ago, probably at this point. So look forward to all of that. I'll talk to you soon.